as Dean of Faculty and Associate Professor of Church History. So on behalf of the North Park Seminary faculty and staff, I welcome each one of you to today's event. And we want to give a special welcome to our students and alumni joining us from Stateville. So we're excited to be able to gather together this morning to inaugurate this year's public programming series sponsored by North Park Theological Seminary. This is now the fourth year that we've been offering public panels, initially prompted by some of the restrictions of COVID. But this year, we're excited to be offering a broader series in conjunction with the publication of our Dean Dennis Edwards book, Humility Illuminated. Here it is, hot off the press, signed copy. So this year, our series is titled Humility as a Prophetic Practice. And so we'll be offering panels sponsored by our disciplinary fields as we have in past years, as well as some additional events, which we'll share with you as we end today's event. So to kick off our series of engagement with Dean Edwards' important work, this morning's panel is sponsored by our ministry field. So I want to give my thanks to Dr. Elizabeth Pierre, our ministry field chair, for coordinating this event. So to begin and to introduce today's guides, our esteemed panelist, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rob Peterson, who is director of the Weborg Center for Spiritual Direction and part of our seminary faculty.
Hi, friends. Welcome. Really glad that you are here. And I look forward with you to a great conversation, interaction today. So first up, I want to introduce Dr. Dean Edwards, who is just going to make some introductory comments about the topic of humility. You will know in our publicity that he referenced this great Christ hymn in Philippians 2, and embedded in that book is this tribute to Christ in a sense, and the line is who humbled himself. So, Dr. Dean Edwards, glad you're here. Would you be willing to make some introductory comments around the theme of humility, and then I'll introduce our panelists next.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Peterson, Rob. I'm grateful. I am so grateful for the folks who are engaging the topic. They have not read the book, so this is really exciting for me that we can make humility a topic of conversation. In fact, that's actually why I think most authors write books, is to get people to talk about the ideas and hopefully engage them. So it's something that's been on my heart for a while, and having been a pastor for about 30 years and a New Testament professor for about 20, some of those years overlapping, I came at this through biblical study and through engagement in my own ministry work, and felt like it was needed for us to examine once again what humility can mean for us in our time, especially in the polarized environment in which we find ourselves. So thanks again.
Great. Thank you. So our panelist today is, first of all, Dr. Peter Ahn, who serves as the founder and the lead pastor of Metro Community Church in Englewood, New Jersey. So let's hear it for New Jersey. He holds a Master's of Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Ministry of Global Leadership from Alliance Theological Seminary. Peter also hosts the weekly podcast, Week Pastor, where he explores the Christian faith from the perspective of vulnerability. So welcome, Dr. Peter Ahn. We also have with us Dr. Michael Walker, as a Canadian theologian and advocate for people with disabilities. He has worked in Ontario and in Chicago. He is currently working on a project on accessibility through Carleton University in Ottawa, where he lives, which puts him next to his 4 nieces. And he tells me he's a classic rock nerd. So welcome, Dr. Walker. And then Dr. Mary Adams Trujillo is a conflict transformation strategist who offers consultation and coaching for individual, organizational, and community transformation. As a researcher, mediator, and spiritual director, she has provided more than 50 years of service to her clients. So welcome, the 3 of you. We're really delighted that you've said yes. And we're going to allow you now, each panelist is going to take 10, 12 minutes to kind of look at this theme of humility from their particular context and perspective. So Dr. Mike Walker is going to go first, and we're glad to hear from you. So the floor is yours.
Very much, Dr. Peterson. I have a low voice and I recently had a dentist appointment. I hope you folks can hear me. If not, please write or talk to me about that. So in a 1934 sermon that he preached in London on 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Lutheran pastor and Nazi resistor Dietrich Bonhoeffer asserts, and I quote him fully, "The Christian relation between the strong and the weak is that the strong has to look up to the weak and never look down. Weakness is holy, and therefore we devote ourselves to the weak." End quote. I think that what Bonhoeffer means here is twofold. First off, he's implicitly urging his listeners to protect vulnerable people, especially people with disabilities, like his friends with intellectual disabilities in a German community called Bethel. Second, Bonhoeffer is implying something about holiness, one of the marks of the church. As Jesus does in the Gospels, and as Moltmann does after him, Bonhoeffer is strongly suggesting here that holiness has to do not with ritual impurity or with physical perfection or imperfection, but with the way that one encounters people who are vulnerable or oppressed. So unlike the Nazis, Bonhoeffer does not believe in the master race or the purity of Aryan society. Rather, he believes that all people, especially his friends with disabilities, embody irreducible, ineffable aspects of the life of God. And I believe, and would therefore assert, that Bonhoeffer's claims relate directly to the questions that Dean Edwards has asked us about humility prior to taking part in this symposium. We were given, I think, 16 questions based on Dean Edwards' book, which just came out, on humility. During my 15 minutes-ish of fame, I'd like to take on 3 or 4 of those cogent and compassionate questions. I look forward to reading Dean Edwards' book someday soon to more charitably engage what I'm certain is a high-minded argument. First up, relative to embodying humility, we were asked whether humility is ongoing or episodic, and whether true humility entails downplaying one's own strengths or abilities. In my own estimation, humility is ongoing, although people can demonstrate humility in precise episodes. The Apostle Paul asks his friends in Philippi, and again I quote fully, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but the interests of others." That is Philippians 2, verses 3 to 4 from the NRSV. So, the way that I read those 2 verses, the Apostle Paul sees humility as a long-term process of learning how to place the concerns of others before one's own needs. And I hope that we all know people like that. Folks who offer their time and their gifts to others out of warmth and generosity without regard to recompense. In fact, the life of the church is sustained by saints like these. People like Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa, Jeffrey Hunter, Mary Chase Zolik, people who give unstintingly because they truly love other people and genuinely desire their well-being. Similarly, Catholic theologian Paul J. Waddell asserts that true friendship is a mutual, liberating, and attractive phenomenon where people enjoy spending time together around shared goods and supporting each other's well-being. Humility, therefore, is an essential aspect of friendship because compassion and integrity cannot exist without humility. We were also asked if true humility entails self-deprecation. I don't believe it does. We need to make a clear distinction here between the overconfidence of hubris, of considering oneself better than others, and the realism of knowing one's own limitations. So in an intellectual arena, when I was much younger, I used to embody overweening confidence in my own ability. In a classroom, I needed to be the loudest voice, the fastest draw, the one with the driest sense of humor, and that didn't last very long. But in terms of knowing my own limitations, as I entered graduate school and my cerebral cortex formed more fully, I entered into a relaxed phase where I became more attentive to the other person and began to enter into what Jewish philosopher Martin Buber calls the I-thou relationship. As my friends and I ate and drank and danced, played games, and had fiery debates. And when I lived with you folks in Chicago prior to the pandemic, I experienced something very similar. Weightlifting is also pertinent. I know my limits with exercise as a person with spastic cerebral palsy. I know, because I've tried, that I can run after a fashion for about a kilometer, so 1.6 miles for you Americans, on my stick-thin legs, and that allows me to run to my friend's aid when they need me. Furthermore, I can press about 400 pounds on good days with those same stick-thin limbs, which centers me when I am assailed by physical or spiritual storms. And I can do like 30 to 50 push-ups in a 5-minute period, which gives me the capacity to lift burdens from my friends and neighbors. I don't have to lift the weight of the world all at once. Rather, I can lift one stone at a time. Furthermore, in terms of reconciling humility, we've been asked, what role does listening well play in the practice of humility? I would call listening well active listening, and I believe that active listening is a vital aspect of true humility. Let me say it this way. I am continually surprised, and not always in a nice way, by people who listen to respond rather than understand in a conversation. We've all seen it as children of the church and the academy. A staunch Chicagoan may say, the Bears are the better football team, but a fervent Minnesotan may interrupt, wrong, the Vikings are way better, and maybe they end up yelling at each other. Or perhaps one person interprets Leviticus 18 one way and one another, and they cite competing Old Testament scholars rather than appreciating each other's arguments. One person says that Israel is right to bomb Gaza, and another that the people of Palestine are correct to respond with violence. I'm not going to touch that one too deeply. But how can folks talk to each other across difference and learn genuine humility? I think it has to do, again, with listening well, active listening. We need to listen to understand each other rather than simply to respond. So in Mark 10, rather than listening to the crowd shouting Bartimaeus down, Jesus listens to Bartimaeus shouting, Son of David, have mercy on me. And he seeks out the son of Timaeus. And he asks him with compassion, what do you want me to do for you? Which is the question that people with disabilities and our allies want to hear from people of able body. That's verse 51. And Bartimaeus asks Jesus for his sight, and Jesus gives it so that Bartimaeus can follow him out of Jericho to Jerusalem directly to the cross. Because Christ listens to Bartimaeus, everybody wins. Now, I'm not sure how that would work out with, say, fans of American football. I've heard that's a highly divisive issue. And I dare not touch the Israel-Palestine divide again, beyond saying that we need to care for each other. But I know that that caring begins with putting aside our own perspectives, thinking of the other person as more important than ourselves, and really listening to them. Take notes if you have to. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. Validate their feelings, and try to see their side. And finally, Dean Edwards has asked us if leaders can be humble and how that might appear. I do believe they can. Leadership is a great power, and as we know from the eminent theologian Stan Lee, with great power comes great responsibility. Naturally, there are different leaders who choose to act on that responsibility differently. For instance, There are some leaders who early on in their tenure may slyly declare themselves very stable geniuses and claim to have the best words. And after all their macho words and multiple horrible acts, may be accused of fraud at best and sedition at worst. At the same time, there are other leaders who in their old age may choose to stand alongside automobile workers in their fight for fair wages, or attempt to pass thoroughgoing healthcare legislation, only to have folks laugh at them for, say, eating ice cream with their wives, or wearing a tan suit in public. To quote Stephen Colbert, that joke was based on a true story, several of them actually. Point is, there are folks who choose to help themselves and end up feeling bitter and lonely, say people like King Saul in 1 Kings. And there are those who help others, like David, or David's greater son, who sometimes get nailed to a Roman cross for their trouble. We can argue about policy in the after party all you folks want, but I believe there's a certain kind of leadership and other-centered, engaged leadership that emerges from humility. And what happens to the people who know but do not downplay their own abilities? How does history treat those who listen well, who serve others, and seek to lift them up? I want to contend, even before I've read Dean Edwards' book, and I'm sure it's fantastic, Dennis, that the history of the world and of the church calls those people saints. One more example, if I may. A while ago, an anthropologist, who may or may not have been Margaret Mead, I can't remember, stumbled on a group of early hominids or human beings and discovered that some of the bones that they had uncovered belonged to someone who had broken a bone and had that bone set by someone else. So if person A had broken a bone and person B had set it for them, then someone had shown someone else compassion, like we're called to. And the anthropologist concluded that that sort of action, the setting of a broken bone, was a sign of empathy, and so was one of the seeds of human civilization. That person, like Bonhoeffer, knew the holiness of weakness and knew that we look up to the weak and never look down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Fantastic. Thank you. Next, we're going to have Dr. Peter on engage this topic. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you so much. And it really is humbling for me to be here. And I just want to just say, Dr. Walker, I'm telling you, as you were speaking, your screen turned purple, man. And I got to tell you, that's, purple is the color of royalty and majesty. And I felt like it was so apropos as you were speaking, because you are a royal child of God. So thank you for sharing your heart with us. And really speaking profoundly. And you're still purple, so there is a glow about you. So that's really cool. I'm not purple, but at the same time, I'm just really happy to be here. And we've been asked to answer a few questions, and one of the questions that I was asked was to answer this question: can leaders actually be humble? Humility almost seems like an oxymoron when we talk about the topic of leadership. And we sometimes actually think as humans that, leaders are not very humble. When you think about some of the leaders that we see today in secular society, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, people like that, we tend to not think of them as their greatest traits as being humble. And I would say probably in secular leadership, humility is not really needed. It's optional. And because there are a lot of secular leaders that are doing, really successful things, impacting culture in some ways. And not all of them are actually humble. It is actually preferred to be humble. Jim Collins wrote a book years ago called From Good to Great. And he says that one of the key marks of a 5-star leader is one of somebody who's really humble. And so it actually is a characteristics that leaders should endeavor to pursue. But I believe in Christian leadership, it is an absolute prerequisite. I just don't believe that God is going to use any Christian leader in any profound way unless the person actually is growing in the character of humility. So it is absolutely important. Humility, I define humility as not somebody who thinks lowly of themselves, because I don't think that's what humility is. Humility is defined as somebody who utterly depends upon God. That's a humble person. A leader who actually fully depends upon God, who realizes that without God's strength, it's not going to happen. And so, as Dr. Walker shared, he talked about weakness, but I just think weakness is actually strength in God's economy. We see weakness as something that's bad or an abnormality in society, but weakness is actually the prerequisite for us to encounter the perfect strength or the supernatural strength of God. Jesus says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, he says, it's only in your weakness can my power be perfected in you. And so I do think this idea of depending fully upon God is what makes a leader humble. And if I can just kind of just share really quickly, there are 5 hungers that leaders go through. Christian leaders, secular leaders, all alike. These are the 5 hungers that we go through. And if we don't keep these hungers in check, it'll actually ruin our capacity to lead and do anything significant for God. All right. The 5 hungers that every leader will struggle with, number 1 is power and control. Number 2, it's affirmation, their hunger to be affirmed. Number 3, their hunger to be important. Number 4, their hunger for intimacy. Everyone longs for intimacy. God's wired us for intimacy. And number 5 is the hunger for sexual pleasure. These are the 5 hungers of everyone, really, but especially in leadership. And I've learned over the years is that when a leader is humble, they are able to take care of these 5 hungers in a way that glorifies God. Without humility, it's impossible to deal with these 5 hungers in any way in which we can live a life in which we glorify God. And so I do believe in Christian leadership, humility is of the absolute importance. And I do believe Christian leaders can, but they more than can, they must be humble. They must be humble. Otherwise, God is not going to be able to use you. It's really interesting because when we talk about the kingdom of God a lot. And, God's kingdom is a monarchy. It's not a democracy. And it's hard for us to picture that because we live in a democracy, right? We vote for the candidates who run our country. And sometimes we begin to believe that also in God's kingdom, it's kind of run more like a democracy than a monarchy, but it's not. God is not here to bless your fiefdom. He wants and he calls us to expand and to grow his kingdom. Right? It's a direct order. He is our king and we are his servant. And so humility is of the absolute importance. It is an absolute prerequisite for leadership. And so I guess one would ask, what does a humble leader look like then? That's one of the questions that Dr. Edwards asked. He says, what does a humble leader kind of look like? And the best way I can share is this, all right? I have a lot of points, but I'm only going to go through a few here. A humble leader, the best way I can share with you is a vulnerable leader. A vulnerable leader, all right? There is a major difference between being vulnerable and being transparent. Transparent, like when you talk to the young generation Zs, when you talk to these young kids, they love being transparent. They love sharing everything. They love sharing everything that they're going through and so on and so forth. That's good, but that's the end. They share and that's it. Vulnerability is very different. When you are vulnerable, you're not only being transparent, but you're being transparent in hopes that you would receive feedback. That's the difference. And that's key. And so if we want to be a leader that is humble, we are calling ourselves to be vulnerable, meaning we need to be transparent, but we also have to be willing to receive feedback, not from everyone, because you shouldn't be vulnerable with everyone, but maybe 1 to 3 people, like how Jesus had it in your life, that you can share everything, not only the highlights of your life, but also some of the hardest struggles in your life. I believe that a humble leader is not a humble leader unless they have actually shared the deepest, darkest secrets to their soul. The things that they have done that they're not proud of, the things that they hope nobody will ever discover, that there's at least one person on this planet that actually knows about it. And that they've been vulnerable. Not only did they share this, but they also were courageous enough to receive some feedback from it. Leadership, humble leadership, is truly about vulnerable leadership. And that's what's really key. And so I believe that a humble leader is somebody who is actually open to receiving feedback in the hopes of growing in self-awareness. A humble leader is, I wouldn't say obsessed, but they consider to be incredibly important the task of growing in self-awareness, to know more about themselves. And we can't grow in self-awareness unless we're willing to receive some feedback, right? And I guess a really quick example is that about a year ago, I actually asked my elders for some feedback on my leadership. I wanted to hear what they thought about my leadership. I trusted them because they're my elder board. And I just said, would you please give me your honest feedback? And one person said to me, one of my elders said to me, she's a counselor, professional counselor. And she says, Peter, I believe you might have ADHD. And I remember when she shared that with me, I was so offended. I was like, I don't have ADHD. She says, no, I think you have ADHD. And I was like, I don't have ADHD. I actually got upset with her that she would even insinuate that to me. But when I got into my car and I was driving home, when I was with her, I was in denial. But when I started to really process it, I actually realized that it would explain so many things about me. That if I actually have ADHD, it would really explain a lot of things. So she encouraged me to get actually evaluated by psychiatrists, and I did. And I do have ADHD. Another elder of mine said to me, she said, how do you think your staff handles the fact that you have favorites, that you play favorites amongst other staff? And I said to her, I was like, I don't play favorites. And she says, I think you play favorites, Peter. And I said, well, I'm going to ask 5 random people from my staff. And I did. And they all said I play favorites. A humble leader receives feedback, not as they're trying to hurt me, but a humble leader takes feedback as a term of endearment. That you would love me so much that you would share that with me. That's a humble leader. And I think that's what a humble leader looks like, where they're willing to receive feedback from the people they love and trust. And they don't take it as you're trying to hurt me, you're attacking me, but they take it as a term of endearment. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. And that's a humble leader. A humble leader, I also believe, and the last thing I'll say about a humble leader is this: a humble leader doesn't just proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. A humble leader is not afraid to demonstrate the power of God. That they're actually willing to not just proclaim the gospel, but they're actually open because they depend upon God and say, God, use me to demonstrate your power. When you read the ministry of Jesus, when you read the ministry of the disciples, they not only proclaim the gospel message, they not only proclaim God, but they also demonstrated his power. And I think one of the things that's so lacking with Christian leadership today, particularly in clergy, is that we're so focused on just proclaiming the word of God, but we're not really focused on demonstrating the power of God. And I think the world, especially those who don't know him, are longing to encounter the power of God. And God is looking for humble leaders so that we can demonstrate his power to the people. That's it. The last question that was asked was then, why do you think the Bible pictures leaders as shepherds? I think it's a fantastic question. Why does the Bible picture leaders as shepherds? And I think it's really a key. Jesus, when he says, I am the shepherd, and he says, I am the shepherd, you are the sheep, Jesus was really key here, because what you need to know contextually in the first century, a shepherd was not a glamorous job. Nobody ever said, one day, I want to grow up and I want to be a shepherd. It was a blue-collar position. It was a dirty vocation. It wasn't clean. But a shepherd is somebody who has sheep that follow them, right? And so leadership is about having followers underneath you. If you don't have anyone that's willing to follow you, you're not a leader. But more importantly, what I've been reminded, especially as a church planter and a founder of the church, I have a lot of power in this church. And what I've learned about this word of shepherd being associated with leadership is that we're called to be humble because we need to see our leadership primarily as a servant of God. Now, I know when you hear that we're called to be a servant of God, it sounds great. It really does. But I'm telling you, it is not easy to be a servant of God. It is very difficult to see yourself as a servant of God. The best example I can give to you is this. is that years ago we did a capital campaign because we were getting ready to hopefully build a community center for the city in which we are ministering in. And as we did this, I had to reach out to people with high net worth that would be willing to give a lot of money to the capital campaign. And so I called one guy, and he disagreed with me. He wanted us to build a church building as opposed to a community center. And I disagreed with him on that. And he hung up on me. And I was so offended by that he would hang up on me. The senior pastor of the church, I was livid. The worst part of it was that 6 weeks later, I had to officiate his daughter's wedding. And we had this huge tension between us. And I did. I officiated his daughter's wedding. Now, usually when you officiate a wedding, the family will give you an honorarium to handle travel costs and different things like that. I didn't get anything. I went to Brooklyn, paid my tolls, which is not cheap here when you go from New Jersey to Brooklyn. And I performed a wedding. I came home, I didn't get anything. And I felt so offended and disrespected. Well, I'm grateful again for the people that are around me. I vented to one of my mentors. His name is Peter Scazzaro, and he wrote the book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And when I shared that with him, he said, Peter, this is the greatest gift you could ever receive from God. And I remember looking at him like, are you crazy? Are you mad? How can this be a gift? And he said to me, he said, Peter, do you preach on Sundays that we're called to be a servant of God? And I said, yeah, no, I do. I preach on that on the regular. And he says, Peter, how are you ever going to know that you're a servant of God if you never let people treat you like one? And I remember that really broke me. That really broke me. And so this image of a shepherd, it's a lowly thing. A shepherd is the one that's willing to roll up his sleeves and get dirty and care and love their sheep. They're willing to leave the 99 and go back and get the one and do whatever it takes. A shepherd is someone who is willing to lead utterly with a mentality of humility and of service to its people. And I think that's the reason why the Bible uses the word shepherd to often describe leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ahn. Wonderful. It's now a chance to hear from Dr. Mary Trujillo. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. This is amazingly wonderful. Just real quick, my feet right now are on the ground in Pittsburgh, home of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who everybody here loves, Reverend Walker, Dr. Walker. Peter Ahn, my thought was ADHD, a divine heavenly dimension. So thank
Wow.
you. Yeah, yeah.
I'm going to write that down. That is wonderful. Thank you for that.
You're so welcome. I'm going to start by praying as, hi, everybody, first of all. Thank you for joining us. I wish I could see your faces. I'm pretty excited about being here. I want to begin with a prayer that Augustine also prayed. And he said, let me humble myself as I exalt you, Lord. Let me think of nothing except you. Let me die to myself and live in you. Let me accept whatever happens as from you. So that's pretty dramatic language. But I'd like to suggest to you that let's try it. Let's see if we can do that. Let's see what that is like. Let's see if that makes a difference in our world. A good teacher doesn't necessarily provide answers to questions that students might have, but instead respects the minds of those students by posing provocative questions. So this time that we have together today, my hope is that some of the questions that are raised will lead us to a more meaningful and practical understanding, specifically of humility, in a way that shows that reconciliation is larger and more important than me, myself, my opinions, my subjective experience, my predicted outcomes, or even my skill set. And I define humility in this way. I see it as a grace that allows us to acknowledge our own limitations and defer to the power greater than ourselves, namely the triune God. And by reconciliation, what I mean is a transformative change in relationships that are broken. You know, as humans, our fundamental broken relationship is between God and ourselves. And what follows naturally is broken relationships between us and other human beings, which we often name as conflicts. And these conflicts extend to nations, they can happen between individuals. And when I say conflict, I'm speaking in a very classic definition of two or more interdependent parties, again, individuals, nations, who interact and perceive that there are threats to needs, values, and resources, and who believe that these threats, these conflicts are irreconcilable. So the operative words are perceive and believe. If we perceive a thing to be impossible, if we perceive a conflict to be irreconcilable, it is. If we perceive that there is a conflict between ourselves and others, or between God and ourselves, there is. So with humans, our own particularities such as race, gender, culture, social status, education, even lately I'm hearing Enneagram numbers and policies may affect how conflict plays out. But the bottom line is still the same. The root cause is power misused, power abused, or power misunderstood. On one hand, humility is paradoxical. So we have this very human and compelling need to prove ourselves, to assert our unique identities. And at the same time, we are utterly dependent on other human beings. We must exist in community. We read that we're not battling flesh and blood, the principalities and powers, but yet we grapple daily with our own pride, our own preconceptions, our desire to win and to hold someone or something in power. We want that. We like that. I think about the hungers that Dr. Ahn mentioned. But it is precisely the paradoxical nature of humility that sets the stage for the possibility of resolving conflict and ultimately for reconciliation. So reconciliation is the big goal, and conflict may be the way that we get there, and humility is the hidden tool. Romans 12:1 declares, if possible, as far as it depends on you, live in peace with everyone. The NLT says, do all that you can do to live in peace with everyone. In the Beatitudes, Jesus gives hope and dignity not to the powerful, to those in humbled circumstances, or as Dr. Walker talked about, those among us who are vulnerable, who are disabled, who are not in power. The poor, the lonely, the disenfranchised, those who experience injustice, those who are hungry, those who are brokenhearted or persecuted, all of those things that we do not want to be. Jesus promises a great reward for those and for those who work for peace. So how do we accomplish these seemingly contradictory goals of realizing ourselves and yet submitting ourselves to God's reality, making peace, making reconciliation? The way out is the way in. And by that, I mean, humility is a virtue shrouded in should, which brings out our natural human inclination toward rebellion, but it also enables us to live as Christ. And a spirit of humility for which Jesus is the perfect model, the embodiment. He's our complete example. But the spirit of humility allows for reconciliation, a process of restoration between God and humanity, because we are able to see that there is something more important than ourselves. Earlier, I called it a grace. Just now, I called it a spirit. It could be, we can call it an attitude. It's not something that comes from our flesh, but it comes from the one who made us and in whose image we remain. Jesus' death and resurrection gave us tangible proof in theory and in practice that reconciliation is possible. So humility allows for repentance. It allows for pride for wrong motives. It allows conflicting parties to look not only at our own selfish ambitions and interests, but to the interests of others. And if you're interested later on, I'll give you, if you just let me know, and I'll give you the scriptural references to these. It allows us to take the nature of a servant. It allows us to have peace in our world, to exchange arrogance for curiosity, rebellion for submission, to exchange shame for honor, to repent, to facilitate, to acknowledge our own human errors and to heal. It allows us to be angry without sinning and to resolve conflict in a timely fashion. Each of these have scriptural references. I'm not making this up. It allows us to separate the problem from the people and to construct processes where reconciliation can occur. It allows us fundamentally to ask the question, what is larger than me? What's more important than me? It makes possible peace where there is war. It makes possible compassion and empathy, both for Jews and Palestinians. It allows us not to make judgments where they are not necessary. It allows us to give other people honor instead of shame. So I want to just close with that prayer famously attributed to Francis of Assisi. And I'd like you, as I read it, to, if you will, close your eyes, and any part of this that you can receive in your spirit that speaks to humility, areas where you might be used, I invite you to do that. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there's despair, let me sow hope. Where there's darkness, may I bring light. Where there's sadness, may I be a vessel for joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved even, and more so to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying to self that we are born to eternal life. Thank you.
Dr. Trio, thank you. What a graceful, beautiful way to talk about humility. So we are going to take questions now for whoever's attending. If you would put your questions in the chat box, that would be great. I'll keep an eye on that. But as you do that, I'm going to invite our panelists, Mike and Peter and Mary. You've heard each other talk about humility. What strikes you about what you heard from each other that you just want to highlight, or maybe you want to ask a clarifying question? So I'll let the three of you interact a little bit, and then we'll start taking questions from our guests who are joining us. So
I really loved hearing both of my brothers speak, and I love even being able to say my brothers. So thank you for your words. Mike, I'm very struck by, and I appreciate that you disclosed your own cerebral palsy experience. And I want to thank you for doing that. I think that takes a lot of courage. And it also helps us to personalize these ideas, or put a face to these ideas of humility and caring for the other. So thank you for that. Peter, you're just amazing. I'm so grateful that you showed us this energy that you have for leading and for being a servant leader. Thank you.
Peter, would you like to go first, or shall I?
I'll let you do it.
Thanks, boss. Yeah. Dr. On, I really, really appreciated the depth of your commentary. Like, you talked about how leaders have to be vulnerable, but that vulnerability is different from transparency. The vulnerability being different from transparency is one of the struggles of my adult life. I want to share things with people verbally, like all the time, and I often overshare according to the people who love me best. But really being vulnerable is creating space, not only for the feedback of the other, as you said so powerfully, but also for the perspective of the other beyond them giving you feedback. It's just, here's my actual experience. And I really appreciated the disclosure of the ADHD thing as well. Our culture is conducive to ADHD. So
yeah.
And Dr. Trujillo, thank you very much for your words as well, for calling me brother. We don't know each other very well, so that's nice. And for your definition, like thorough definition of reconciliation and conflict resolution, it's going to resonate with me for a while before I've fully processed it. But that was very powerful as well. So thank you for doing that.
Just for me, I just concur with both of you. First and foremost, thank you for just sharing and being honest with your heart, and also offering your expertise. It was really heartfelt, and I'm just grateful to be a part of this panel. And I don't know, this is the first time I've ever met both of you, and so I am really looking forward to, hopefully there'll be other paths where we would cross, that we could connect, maybe grab a meal, drink a cup of coffee, and just kind of get to know each other more, as I realize I have a lot to learn from the both of you. So thank you so much for sharing your heart with us as well.
I invite questions now from anybody who is on our call. And as that happens, I have an observation, and I wonder if our panelists would engage it. It seems that all of you shared particular perspectives on power. And so I'm curious for you to maybe expand a little bit, that humility is connected to how we use power, maybe how we see power in ourselves and how to use it, but then how to avoid the abuse of power as we interact with people in a humble way. So it was all three of your presentations had something to do with power. So I'm just curious if you want to talk a little bit more about your perspectives on misuse and use of power as individuals, institutions, etc.
This is Mike. I can't believe I forgot this, Mary. I really appreciated everything that you said about interdependence in your presentation. That is a key aspect of power, especially in our society, our super individualistic society. And yeah, we can't, as you said so clearly, we cannot really live without each other and without acknowledging all of the grace that we receive from a higher power, from God. That is super important. And when you thanked me for disclosing my disabilities, I was I was taken aback for a minute, but then I also remembered another word from the Apostle Paul, which is, not many are strong, not many are wise, etc. Some of us are, the weak vessels who critique the strong. And that is one of the places that I dwell in as part of the church. And I think that's one of the things that folks with disabilities and other people who are vulnerable, don't get me wrong, not just people with disabilities, but also everyone else who experiences different kinds of oppression can offer to the church is we have to connect to each other. That's why the thing in Gaza, the war in Gaza is so important, because we are all connected, whether we are directly connected to the suffering of Palestinians and Israelis or not.
And I would like to suggest, just in terms of, in response, that we are directly connected. We are, whether we know someone or whether we don't, we are directly connected, I believe, with all of God's creation, because we are creation. I think this is a significant moment in time where our notions of power and privilege and connection are being intensely challenged. The old ways that we've done don't work. It's not working, clearly. Can I also give a shout out to my Statesville brothers? I see you all.
Mm-hmm.
God bless you. Good to see you again.
You know, I would just like to share something about power. I think there's a difference between power and authority. I think the goal of a humble servant or a leader is we should aim or strive to grow in authority, not necessarily power. Because, like you said, that power can actually be destructive, right? We could use it to hurt people. You know, a police officer tells you to pull over from a car, you got to do it. Why? Because at the end of the day, he's got a lot of power. He wields a lot of power. He's got the support of government and so on and so forth. Authority is different. Authority can only be given to us, or authority can only be created by our willingness to sacrifice for the other person. And that's the difference between power and authority. And authority, when somebody has authority, you submit and you listen, right, to them in that way, because they've gone through it. They've sacrificed in so many ways. The best example I can give is, you know, a relation between a mother and a son, or a mother and a daughter. And, I hope I'm not being culturally insensitive, but one of my closest friends is Dr. Alex G. Some of you might know him as a covenant pastor. And I'm going to be actually traveling to Mexico on Friday to celebrate his 60th birthday. But I still remember when we were hanging out in New York City, his mother was with us, and he was like in his early 50s. And I got him into trouble because I shared something with his mother that I shouldn't have. And I just saw Alex just submitting to her authority. I couldn't believe it. Right? He's this adult man, but at the end of the day, he did that because she has incredible authority over his life because of how much sacrifice she made on his behalf. There is a authority there. And I think that is it. And I think that's why God has authority over us. He sent Jesus Christ to die for us on the cross, resurrect from the dead. It's powerful. It's that authority. And so I think a humble leader should really strive to build authority that's deeply rooted in our willingness to sacrifice.
Nice. So we have a question from our Stateville friends, and it's this: is having privilege incongruent with acting in humility? Is having privilege incongruent with acting in humility?
This is Mike. My answer, as clearly as possible, is no, because privilege, when we use it rightly, lifts the other person up, right? Like Jesus has an encounter with the Canaanite woman whose daughter experiences demonic possession, and she's like, "Master, teacher, come heal my daughter." And he gives her a racial slur as a gift. You know, we don't give the master's food to the dogs. And she says, the dogs still eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And that changes his perspective on her daughter and on her. And he puts out his power and he heals her, albeit from a distance, but it's still really effective because he sees, as Dr. Trujillo just said, we are all, right? We are all part of God's creation. And as Dr. On just said, Jesus, his authority grows in that moment because he learns how powerful he actually has to be to fulfill God's mission. It has to encompass everybody, not just the people of Israel.
I wanted to jump in. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Trujillo. I was thinking about that question a lot, and I think for me, it was the flip side. It's like, what about the folks who are in the bottom of society, and do we even ask them to be humble? Like, what does that mean? So when I think about the powerful, it's not incongruent, but I would say those with privilege, maybe to take the language of my Stateville brothers, those who have privilege, it's not incongruent, but it's like what you're saying, there's a certain burden on those in privilege to work on behalf of those on who don't have. And I think that's what Dr. Walker was saying in his opening comments. But my challenge is, how do those words land on the ears of someone who's already been pushed to the sides and marginalized? Like, what might humility, or do we even think about it in those terms? So that's a different question. But I want to echo what Dr. Walker was saying about using privilege rightly.
Thank you.
I think of humility as we used to say, an equal opportunity employer, that one does not have to have. First of all, I think that all of us operate out of various areas where we have privilege, social privilege, moral privilege. They're different kinds of privilege. And I'm wondering, what if we thought about privilege as simply an acknowledgement of where we live, what we deal with, and who we are, which we only know when we are in relationship to the one who created us. So some of us may have more money, some of us may have education, some of us may have maleness or whiteness or whatever the whatevers are, that look like privilege. And yes, there is a responsibility that I have to ask, how do I use whatever gifts that I have, not just for myself, but for others who are also part of creation? But do I have to deny that I have some gifts? No, I don't. I have some social status that other people do not have. It doesn't make me better, but it does require that I ask the question, how can I use whatever I have to be better? Real quick example, obviously I am African American, and I come from people who did not have a lot of stuff. But what they did have was a consciousness of the responsibility of taking care of other people, of creation. We care for each other. That's what we do. It doesn't matter what you have. This is what you do, because this is why we exist. I have to resist the temptation when I'm on these to start preaching. So forgive me if I'll try to pull myself back on that.
We don't mind you preaching.
It's all
We love
good,
it.
Mary.
Keep
It's all
going.
good, Mary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody else want to continue responding to
I'll just say really quickly, I think Jesus is a great example. He had quite a bit of privilege while he was here on earth, but he was truly humble. He used it in a way to love and care. And so I do think those two can exist at the same time, as Dr. Walker says, as long as we steward it and we do it to uplift and love and care for God's people, and we use it to defeat the powers of darkness. I just think it can be done. So yeah.
So Dr. Dodson from North Park Seminary writes in the chat box, I was struck by the response of Dr. On's friend. How are you ever going to know that you are a servant of God if no one ever treats you like one? The content of the quote is itself striking, but I was most impressed by how the friend reframed the incident to you, Dr. On, and how important that was for your formation. So the question that it raises for me is, how have each of you cultivated humility in your own lives? How do you sustain it? And what is the role of community in helping you grow in this practice of humility? Great question. So you ponder that, and then we'd like to hear from each of you.
Yeah, I'll just share very quickly because I already kind of shared. But for me, it's I have a few soulmates in my life. I call them soulmates. These are people who I share my soul with. They're men, most of which are clergy, pastors, and I just I just share being very vulnerable with them. And vulnerability, again, is not just being transparent, but really receiving feedback. And I feel like in many ways that kind of helps me to grow in greater dependence upon God, and it really allows me to encounter His mercy in a real deep way. And so I think it's hard to really be prideful and cocky when you are actually exposing everything about who you are, the good, but also the bad and the real ugly about your humanity. But it's freeing too to know that I have no secrets, that when I die, I'm fully known, and that there is this beauty of God's grace and mercy that I get to encounter in such a way. I was reading the story of the woman that was caught in adultery, and you know how the Pharisees took her and said, "We got to stone her to death." And I was just blown away again when Jesus said, "Hey, did anyone stone you?" And she's like, "No," because Jesus says, "If anyone here is without sin, be the first to cast a stone." And then he says, "Well, neither do I. Go and sin no more." And it's just that mercy. God's mercy allows us to sin no more. It's His mercy. His mercy shouldn't be used as a pass to sin. His mercy and grace needs to be absorbed in our lives in such a way where it propels us to say, "I don't want to sin anymore." And when I confess my sins vulnerably and I receive feedback, it allows me to tangibly encounter the mercy and the grace of God, where it encourages me to not commit the sin again, to do my best. I still do, but to do my best. And so just putting yourself in close proximity to God's mercy like that in a very tangible, concrete way helps me to be humble.
Great, good. Mike or Mary, how do you cultivate this personally? Both muted. There
Go ahead, Mike.
we go.
All right, humility in practice. So it is not visible. There are many things about me that are not visible. Among them, I have intellectual disabilities, which include sometimes an ability to read social cues, or more accurately, a desire or lack of desire to read social cues. So I spent a long time as a child and a young adult not fully reading, often ignoring other people's social cues and getting in their space and disrespecting their need versus my own need for touch and verbal affirmation. It got on people's nerves enough, I'll say it politely, in my 20s, that there were a couple people like Peter's soulmates who came alongside me and explicitly said, "Dude, you have to step back and assess a little bit. You're freaking some people out in the community. We need you to not take part for a bit and think about why this might be happening for you." And those conversations were formative for me, and they informed my own vulnerability in cognitive behavioral therapy and other forms of psychotherapy in which I have also actively taken part. And that allowed me to become a little bit more relaxed and to actively practice humility. The other big thing for me as a super verbal person is, and if I'm talking all over you classic introverts, you can stop me at any time, right? The other thing is the gift of silence. Before I was 30, I had never spent 10 minutes or more in expectant silence waiting for God to say something to me. And after that series of conversations with my therapist and with a few other folks who are close to me in Toronto, I realized how deeply I need silence. So now, almost every day, I spend 10 or 15 minutes either going for a walk or sitting, meditating, waiting for God to speak to me, rather than trying to actively do stuff or trying to make things happen.
So as they say in my church, I wasn't always saved. So I've spent a lot of my life not trying to be humble, quite the contrary. But as I mentioned to you, teaching, well, I didn't say, but teaching has been a source of both my most proud and as well as my most humbling experiences. Aging has helped me to be humble. That's helped a lot. But two things I want to share. One is at a spiritual level, recognizing where God has brought me and how faithful God has been throughout. When I was not, like I said, I've not always been saved, is one source. But the other is, talk about transparent and vulnerable. I'm going to share this because I can't see most of you. And do me a favor, when I see you again, don't bring it up, okay? When I was teaching, one time I was teaching a public speaking class. This really was a turning point. I feel like I should turn my camera off. And in the public speaking class, I had a student who was terrified of speaking. Like, she would get up and she would just start shaking. Well, at one point in the class, I had my back to the class and I was writing something on the board. Now, let's just say I had a little gas. And that sound of a fart, you can't disguise it. You can't cough it and make it sound like it's something else. A fart is a fart, and everyone knows. So there I was with my back to the audience or to the class. And I thought, should I stay up here forever and keep my face to the blackboard, or should I turn around and face them? So the end of this story was when the young woman was getting ready to do her speech, she said to me, if you can fart in front of a class, I guess, and not die, I guess I can make a speech. And she did. And she was good. So that was humbling, but it was transformative. Thank you for allowing me to share. Don't ever repeat it with my name.
I really appreciate that, Dr. Trujillo. And I got a list of things for myself. But that one of the things about this question about cultivating humility that was sort of with me the whole time I was writing the book and thinking about it. So I tend to ask that question back to people I've been talking about, talking to about the book. But all of you hit on something that was a big theme for me. All of you hit on it, and I feel so affirmed in it, even though you didn't know that, is that I see humility as starting out with our relationship to God. So, and I think Dr. Ahn said it very straightforwardly in his remarks, that there's something about who I am before God, that's where it starts for me. So the cultivating part for me is the checking in on how I'm doing in my relationship with God. So, and I think that helps me to grow in what I hope and perceive as humility, is if I'm nurturing my relationship with God. So then that way I can weather the critics, I can weather the sycophants who, just want to pump you or whatever it is, but I can handle that if I have this right, relationship with God, that is the real compass, So that's the way I've been thinking about it.
Dr. Edwards, are there other ways that you have found cultivating? And there are other panelists in addition, cultivating a good level of self-awareness and humility?
Yeah. Well, I will add, when you mentioned self-awareness, Rob, it's come through in everybody's comments too. Okay, it starts with our relationship with God, but how our relationship with other people helps to provide those checks, right? It's like how we're doing with each other, or with those honest people that we trust that can speak into our lives. And then we also mentioned therapy. All of that to me is so it's refreshing to hear that. I mean, I think I just wanted to write about it because I feel like for a while therapy was like a secret thing. You couldn't talk about it in church circles, and that kind of stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is the nurturing comes in our growing in self-awareness, which happens through our interactions with other people and our devotion to God, which I hope grows as we grow. So yeah, I guess I didn't put a 1, 2, 3 on it, but it's, like a step thing, but it's more about how I am responding to the input that I'm given about myself, but also when I take the initiative to do the things that would help me draw close to God, whether that's contemplative things or activist things, but all the things that help me to connect better to God. That's it for me.
That's great. So I have a question. There's more in the chat, but I wanted to engage all of you in who would you name as humble people in your life? And what did you learn from them? Because I'm assuming that humility is something that we're gifted by the Spirit with, yes, but also we learn from others. So who have been good humility models for you?
I'll go first. I have a few that I would say are incredibly humble leaders. One would be somebody who's currently still on my staff. His name is Dr. David Hosang. And David was my supervisor while I was at Fuller, and I served under him while I was at my church in California at the time when I was studying at Fuller. David holds a PhD in New Testament at Oxford. He's an incredibly, he's taught at different seminaries around the country, around the world, actually. Has been a pastor much longer than me, and he was my boss for about a year and a half or so when I was his intern. And I would say about 9 years ago, I invited David to join our staff if he'd be willing to join the Metro staff as our pastor of spiritual formation. And he agreed to do that, and he moved from California to New Jersey. And I just think he's such a humble man that he would be willing to submit, to my leadership, even though I was once his intern. And he has like no problem doing it. There's no struggle, no issues there, and it's just it's amazing to see that. And I think he is one of the best personifications of a humble leader, a humble servant that I've ever seen and met. The other person I would just say is somebody that I just shared with you, the guy who, Pete Squizzero, who shared with me about my experience with that guy who hung up on me on the phone. I've had opportunities to really connect with him. And not only does he like to give good and hard advice, but I know that he's also a very humble guy where he also receives and hears, and he tries to grow deeper. And one of the things that I realized why I know that he actually demonstrates humility is not just looking at the successes of his ministry, but actually in how much passion he has for his wife. The marriage is just, I mean, it's not just one that's filled with commitment, but he is absolutely passionate about his wife, Jerry. And that can't happen unless there's a sense of humility where you're willing to submit and learn from each other and grow from each other. And I see that to be such an amazing thing and a great example that I see in him. So he's definitely another person that I would say is incredibly humble.
Others. Thanks.
This is Mike. There are so many people that I don't want to keep you all here for hours, but I will name two, one of whom is in this Zoom room. Paul Denai, how you doing? Paul has been a good friend to me pretty much from the word go, which was mid-August of 2018. He befriended me and he brought me into his house and he shared his life with me. And we've kept doing that through Zoom conversations a lot like this one. He exemplifies, Dr. On, what you were talking about in terms of transparency, not just, or actual vulnerability and not just transparency, but we share a lot of the important things that go on in each other's lives. And we learn a lot from each other. And we have these really highbrow conversations about how we respond to difference. And so Paul is one, and another one. There are a couple people that I befriended in high school and in undergrad who check in with me continually, just like on Facebook, and just keep liking my status, and we keep tabs on each other in a very ephemeral, not totally personal way, but it's really affirming to look up and say, hey, Jared really liked that. That's great. Oh, here he is playing bass. Here he is with his 2 children in Calgary, that sort of thing. It's just really interesting to know that there are people who are rooting for you, even from behind the scenes.
Nice. Any other examples of humility mentors?
I'm going to mention a pastor that I know from the East, and he's still out East, and we have a regular check-in with each other. I think one of the things that I have appreciated is to be like, I think Dr. Arn was saying this too, that you can be corrected and people can point out things and you don't get, and I'm not immediately defensive because of the way this person has treated me else, at other times, and I think I find this person to be rather encouraging, affirming, but in very honest, ways, not just lauding praise on me, whatever. So I guess it's been balanced. I was trying to I'm fishing for the right kind of words, but that's how they treat me. I think it's the thing but I think they treat everybody that way. I mean, it's the way I feel, it's sort of like, it's not just that the way they treat Dennis, but I think humble people help other people to feel heard and seen and valued, which I think is coming through in our conversation. So the models that I have are people who have made me and others feel seen and valued and affirmed. Sometimes I meet people, I think they view others as threats rather than as, people to be valued and affirmed. So my model, this is one guy, Pastor Randy, I see him as somebody who views me as someone to be valued and not as a threat.
Lovely. Mary, any examples? You're muted.
I have some personal models, but I think that the one that stands out that I want to share is Mother Teresa has always just been, that's who I want to be. Reading her autobiography, though, was very interesting that I would say she suffered from chronic depression most of her life, during most of her work. But she kept doing it.
So Dr. Denai wrote earlier in our chat, and has a question around the theme of pity and humility. Said it was stated that humility is not self-effacing. Transparent vulnerability that welcomes feedback could lead to people viewing the disabled community or someone with ADHD or someone passing gas in public with pity. But pity demeans others. How do you react to pity with humility that is not self-effacing and still demonstrates servant leadership? So how do you react to pity with humility that is not self-effacing and still demonstrates servant leadership? Mike.
The single sentence answer, Paul, is sometimes with difficulty, but all of my adult life is instructive in this respect. When I stand up, you folks are going to notice that I walk with a pronounced gait. When I walk around on the street, I sometimes get strange looks or passing glances, or in one case, an attempt at faith healing prayer, which was very, very scary from people. But I really appreciate when children who don't know any better are walking around with somebody like their babysitter or their parent or whatever, and they say, "Why is that man walking funny?" And sometimes in Toronto, I was able to say, "Because my legs don't work the same way yours do." Or when I was on the streetcar on the Toronto Transit Commission, sometimes I would have a homeless person say, offering me a seat, "Hey, give this guy a seat, he's a cripple." And I say, "I'm not a cripple, thank you, but I'd still like a seat."
Nice. Anybody else want to engage Paul's question?
My response to Paul's comment was that I put in the chat is, I'm not responsible for someone else's attitude toward me. That's their issue.
Good. Peter?
I just think, Mike probably said it best. I don't really have tremendous experience in this, but I do recognize that, we're all broken people. And sometimes, we say things and, if it's not pity that's rooted in compassion, but it's rooted into demeaning us. I think for me, I just kind of take that more as I don't necessarily take it so personally. I just take it more from the perspective of, what, the person is just a broken person, doesn't really understand, and it's okay. As long as I know who I am and I'm secure in who I am, I don't really let it really bother me much. So I haven't really given much thought to that kind of question. It's such a deep question. I'd probably have to think about it a lot more, but I think Mike answered it the best, honestly. And I just think, he put it the best way. So.
I'm wondering if our Stateville friends, if you have a question for our panelists, an additional question. And while you think about that, Catherine, Dr. Catherine Gilliard, yes, she had you could read in the chat, as God began with both male and female being transparent with one another, I wonder why we have come to believe that we need to have same-sex inner circle members to bear our souls, to help us practice humility. I think we can have these inner circle groups, but if they are the only inner circle circles we operate from, we are missing some great wisdom. Women have spent many formative years bearing their souls to men, but there still seems to be a strange challenge for male leaders to see women as inner circle members who can help them with their formation. Is it a blind spot to how we receive correction from women colleagues or something else? Great question.
Yeah, I think it's an awesome comment and observation. And I was just with Dr. Gilliard in the Southeast Conference just a few days ago, and I so admire her leadership. I mean, I don't want to start backpedaling and saying, yeah, but I think that's just a great observation. I will say there are different points in my life, maybe because I'm older, it wasn't modeled well for me because there were only male leaders, in the churches that I started to come up in. And so I've had to learn that. But there have been times I can think of my seminary experience where there's one sister, my wife, who's actually on this Zoom in the Zoom room. She's one of those people, but she could affirm, this mutual friend of ours that has spoken pretty straightforwardly into my life over the years. And I've learned some great wisdom from her. So I wish, I wish it could be a more balanced and equitable kind of distribution there. I think it's a big learning curve, unfortunately, for us, especially within, maybe evangelical kind of circles or evangelical adjacent.
Mary, Peter, Mike, any response?
Only to say that most of the strongest people I know are women, and many of my closest friends are women. So I do not entirely relate to the question that was asked. And in the spirit of humility, I yield the rest of my time.
I'll share, Catherine, I think you share such an important, you made such an important point here. And I'm not going to sit up here and just tell you that, that I have an army of women that speak into my life. I wish I did. I think part of this is just my own natural tendency to seek out male mentorships as opposed to women. Not to think that women are lesser than, absolutely not. I actually believe women, and if I'm going to be very honest, I think they are a better, just when I look at the staff that I have, a lot of times they're smarter, stronger leaders, much more sound in judgment, so on and so forth. I have a few women mentors that I still lean upon, one of which being Brenda Salter McNeil, is somebody that I still connect with and I get input and advice from. She's been really helpful. Been a couple people on my staff that I lean on. I have a pastoral management team in which women are in there. It's my executive leadership and they speak into me. And then my elder board, we have women members in our elder board. And the two people that have really spoke truth into my life that gave me that truth feedback were actually the women. And they just were so bold in giving me that feedback. And I have been so grateful for that. So I know without a shadow of a doubt that women are amazing leaders, and they are the ones that I can learn tremendously from. And I'm trying. I actually did try, and this is not a cop out, but a couple years ago, I actually sought out a woman minister, doctor, a professor, and I really tried to seek her out more and try to see if I could connect with her and that if she'd be willing to mentor me. It didn't. I just never really heard back from her, and I don't know what the reasons of that was, but it's something that I am really trying to do more of and realize that this is something that I do need. So.
Good. Good.
So I'm not, I'm going to issue a disclaimer. I am not part of the covenant. However, I have lived among y'all, and I would like to say that this is a wonderful challenge for the denomination to put the talk about humility into practice. It seems that the clergy women in the denomination have been third-class citizens for a very long time, that there has been essentially lip service, I say this as an outsider, to the idea that women are fine, or women are okay leaders. That's not the case. That's not the practical reality that I've seen. So part of the humility, to me, part of the challenge is, let's acknowledge this ginormous elephant in the room, that there is sexism, there is heterosexism, there are patriarchal traditions that are kept strongly intact, there is a good old boys club, all that stuff. And it's a wonderful opportunity to begin to say, how might I use the privilege or power, and however it exists with us, even those of us who are female, to bring balance, to bring the kingdom of God fully into the denomination. And I understand that there are probably technical questions, and there are churches that say women cannot be pastors. I understand the theological piece, but there are enough other people will acknowledge there's a problem here. Women are not treated as equals. Women are not valued in the same way as their male counterparts.
Thank you, Mary. Well, we've come to our published ending, but we have
of
one
course,
more.
now we want to end it.
Mary gets the last word. No, we have one question from our Stateville friends, and Dr. Dennis, I wonder if you would be willing to take this one. As leaders, we often are faced with having to make difficult decisions that are not often understood by those that follow us. How do we maintain our humility in the midst of such misunderstanding?
Yeah, I think for me, my quick answer is, you got to do what you got to do. I mean, you've got to do what you perceive as the right thing, that's in line with your calling, your responsibility, with Dr. On's word, your authority in that role, and be prepared to take some hits. But in taking the hits, the challenge, I think, for us is to not have to respond to every criticism to defend ourselves. Part of the job is going to be taking some criticism. And so humility means, I understand that's part of the way things are. So humility is not a criticism-free process. I mean, it's, excuse me. So we would maintain our humility by not fighting back and demanding that people have to agree with the tough decision that I made. Rather, I have to deal with the criticism.
Great. Well, friends, let's thank our panelists the best we can on Zoom. So thank you, all of you. And I want to turn our time over now to Dr. Pierre, who's going to close our time in prayer. So
again, thank you, each of you. What a gift. I felt, Han and I were laughing and talking because we're so engaged. with what was happening and having ideas about future stuff given based on what you shared. And the questions also reflect what a gift that you've been to our community today. With that said, I would like the panelists, before I share a couple of more concluding remarks, to stay on when everyone else is off. There's just a couple of things I want to talk to you about. But thank you. Thank you, Luke Parmalee behind the scenes, making sure everything runs smoothly, to our deans, Dean Hanna, Dean Edwards for the book. Shout out again for Rob, Dr. Rob did a fabulous job moderating. It can be challenging, trying to look at the chat and make sure everything runs smoothly. And again, Dr. Trujillo, Dr. Ahn, and Dr. Walker, thank you for your wisdom and your gifts. Couple of announcements. Actually, Dean Dr. Edwards and Dennis's book, I put your name everywhere. There you go. We'll have his book launch on November 13th from 4 to 6 p.m. right on North Park's campus, right?
Yep, in Niva Hall, Olson Lounge.
Okay. A big shout out to Lily Endowment who's made this happen. And finally, if you're attending the January Midwinters Conference, we hope you'll join us for lunch on Tuesday, January 23rd, for an author conversation with Dr. Dean Edwards. All are welcome to join. Signups are in your midwinter registration. Okay. Let me close this out in prayer. Thank you guys for making time to join us today. And we're going to have a next one in spring, another forum.
Yes, I believe March 6th.
March 6th.
Memory served.
Okay, so you'll be getting more information about that. But thank you. Let me close this out in prayer. God, thank you for this time. Thank you for these brothers and sisters who just shared their hearts, their mind, and their passions all around humility, God. And we've all learned more about you and about how you want us to be in the world, God. May we take what we've learned today with us, and may you continue to bring light to what was shared so that we may walk humbly before you, our God. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. Panelists, stay on. And Rob, stay on too, Rob. Please.